So reading music is just one element of a person's musicianship and their musical ability. And the stronger you are at reading music, the stronger that will likely help you to be in the other areas as well. So you want to strengthen that muscle while you're also strengthening the other musical muscles. Hi guys, welcome back to the All About Music channel. I'm Esther. So today is a crash course on how to read music, and we are going to be focusing on a few different things. First of all, reading music really is a few different skills that are put together in one. So first we're going to talk about note identification, so being able to identify the musical symbol and know exactly which note or which pitch that stands for. Second, we're going to be talking about interval recognition, and that kind of is a complicated sounding word, but it's a much more simple concept than what it may sound like. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, we're going to talk about how to understand the rhythmic aspect of notes. So all of those three things combined together is going to help you be able to read music very quickly and very easily. Now, this will take some practice and some hard work. Usually, these concepts can be understood probably in the matter of 15 or 20 minutes. You can understand the basics of reading music. So that's what I am seeking to do in this video. But in order to really master these concepts and to be able to apply them to your music making, you'll also want to dedicate some good time to practicing and reviewing these concepts every single day until they become natural to you. So first, I'd like to address, why do you want to read music in the first place? Why is it so important? Sometimes there are two sides to this. Some people may say, well, it's so important to learn to play by ear. It's so important to learn how to listen to music and be able to just play that, or to be able to think about what you want to play and to be able to just play that without having to read music. While that is definitely true, and I agree with that, there also is another side to this. If you are unable to read music and you're not able to understand musical notation, that actually will end up limiting you in many ways when it comes to being a musician. For example, if you want to play with a group of friends, or maybe you want to play in your church service, or maybe you're a songwriter and you want to be able to write down the music that is coming to you. If you are not familiar with musical notation, that will end up being a big hindrance to you. You won't be able to join into groups and play with other musicians as quickly, and it will be a much more time-consuming process for you to figure out how to write down the music that you are thinking of in your head, or maybe just playing on your keyboard or playing on your instrument. And on top of that, if there are specific songs that you want to learn how to play, it is going to be much easier to be able to get some sheet music and learn what that songwriter or that composer has written, rather than having to try to figure it all out by ear. That can be an extremely challenging thing to do. So reading music is just one element of a person's musicianship and their musical ability. And while there are some other things that are extremely important to have and to be able to do as a musician, reading music is one of those things. And the stronger you are at reading music, the stronger that will likely help you to be in the other areas as well. So you want to strengthen that muscle while you're also strengthening the other musical muscles, including learning things by ear, learning to recognize intervals, and all of that fun stuff. And really quickly, before we jump into note identification, if you're in the process of learning an instrument or learning something specific in your musical journey, I'd love to hear what that is in the comments below. You can just go ahead and drop a comment down below. I always love to hear from you all and to know how I can help you even more in these videos. So first of all, we're going to talk about note identification. So the first thing that is very important to address is the clef. Now, the clef is a way of writing out the notes to be able to quickly identify and understand what pitches we need to play. So there are several different types of clef. The easiest way to understand a clef is that they are made up of 5 lines and 4 spaces. Now, there are several different types of clefs, and depending on what instrument you are playing, your music may be written on a different type of clef. So the 2 most common clefs that we are going to be specifically learning about today are the treble clef and the bass clef. These are the two that you will see most commonly for most instruments. And then there are a couple other types of clefs, for example, the C clef and some others that are used for some of the strings or some of the wind or brass instruments. So depending on what instrument you're playing, you may need to learn a different clef from the treble or the bass clef. Now, if you are playing the piano, the treble and the bass clef are put together for the right and the left hand, and it is called the grand staff. But again, each clef is made up of 5 lines and 4 spaces. And if we talk about numbering them, so if I were to say, what note is on line number 1, that would be the bottom line of the 5 lines. And then we number them from bottom to top. So it would be line number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then you follow a similar system for the spaces. You start at the bottom to number them and move upward. So space 1 is at the bottom, space 2 is above that, space 3, and then space 4 is above that. Now, before we actually get into the specific note names on the treble and the bass clef, I want to talk about 2 specific types of intervals on the clef. This has to do with how far the notes are moving up or down from each other. So when we're looking at the lines and spaces, if we see a note that is on one line and then we see the next note on the next line. So the notes are moving from a line to a line. When you see that type of movement, we can call that a skip. And in terms of interval, because interval just means the distance between 2 notes, we would call that a third. Now, for right now, I'm going to be using the term skip because I think that is a very helpful and simple way to think about it. So when you're moving from a line to a line, that would be called a skip. Now, similarly, if you have 2 notes that are moving from one space to the next space adjacent to it, that is also called a skip. Now, what if we see a note that moves from a line to a space adjacent to each other, or you see a note that moves from a space to a line adjacent to each other? That would be called a step. In just a moment, when we start talking about the musical alphabet, I will explain why this is so important to understand steps and skips in learning to read music. Now, let's move on to talking about the musical alphabet. So the musical alphabet is the terminology that we use to label or name each specific pitch and what it is. The musical alphabet has 7 letters that correspond to 7 different pitches, and then that same set of 7 letters repeats over and over and over. So they are A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then they will start over again. Now, in the musical clef notation, when we're naming notes, if the notes are moving higher on the clef, that means that you're going to be moving forward in the alphabet, like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, as you move higher on the clef. If the notes are moving lower on the clef, the musical alphabet will go backwards, like G, F, E, D, C, B, A, G, F, E, D, C, B, A, and so on. So that is one important thing to know, that if you're moving in an upward direction, the musical alphabet moves forward. If you're moving in a downward direction or lower on your instrument, the musical alphabet is moving in a backwards direction. All right, so now let's talk about how we put the clef and the musical alphabet together to actually write notes on both the treble and the bass clef specifically. So first of all, we are going to talk about the treble clef. When it comes to the treble clef, there's a really important thing to know. The treble clef can also be called the G clef, and there's a couple reasons for this. The first main and important reason that the treble clef is called the G clef is that it is centered around the note of treble G. Treble G is just a G that is a specific pitch in the treble clef. And it's very easy to identify this specific note because the treble clef actually wraps around the G line. So the treble G line is the second line, line number 2, up on the treble clef. Now, another way to remember that the treble clef is the G clef is that the shape of the treble clef actually looks kind of like a fancy, curly, cursive G. Once you know this note G, now we're going to talk about what each line and each space of the treble clef is called. So from bottom to top, the lines of the treble clef are E, G, B, D, F. And you may have heard this acronym before. Commonly, people will say, every good boy does fine. Now, in my opinion, if you are going to come up with an acronym to help you remember those lines, I would actually come up with something on your own that's funny, that you're going to remember, but for what it's worth, that's the one that everybody uses. Now, the spaces of the treble clef are F, A, C, E, from bottom to top. And as you can see, they spell the word face. So you can simply memorize this, and that can help you to learn what each line and what each space is in terms of the note names. For me though, in terms of reading music, I think a much more helpful way to think about this is to memorize where treble G is, and then memorize a couple other key notes that are on the treble clef. The next key note that I think is very important to know is treble C. So treble C is the third space up, space number 3, if you're counting from the bottom, 1, 2, 3, and that would be treble C. Treble C is the next C that's an octave above middle C. Then I would recommend that you memorize where middle C is. Middle C is on the line that is just below the treble clef. When you come off of the clef and you have notes that are written either above or below the standard 5-line 4-space clef, these lines are called ledger lines. So middle C is the first ledger line below treble clef. Now, once you've learned these few very important landmark notes on the treble clef, then you can think about the movement of notes based on steps and skips, which we talked about a little bit before. So remember that if you see 2 notes that are moving from a line to another line that are just next to each other or adjacent to each other, those notes are called a skip. And in the musical alphabet, what happens is if you have a note that's moving from one line to the next line, or from one space to the next space, the notes are jumping over one letter name. So for example, if you're moving from the treble G line, which is the second line, up to the third line, you would think about the musical alphabet, which goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then starts over again at A. And you would think, okay, I'm at G, and now this is a skip. So you'd skip over A, and what comes right after A? B. So the notes are moving from G to B. Now another example as a space note to a space note would be if we're moving from the first space to the second space. So the first space we know is F, and then if we think about the alphabet, right after F comes G, so we'd skip over G, and then the next note is A. So we're moving from F to A. So if you think about notes in terms of the interval movement, which just means how far you're moving from one note to get to the next note, and you think of the steps and the skips that are involved to get from one note to the next note, it can get much easier to read the notes quickly. All right, so let's move on to the bass clef. So the bass clef can also be called the F clef. And the reason for this is primarily because it is built centered around the bass F pitch. As you can see here on the bass clef, on line number 4, so that's counting from bottom to top, line number 4 is the pitch of bass F. Now as you can see, the bass F clef symbol is built with the first little dark dot right on that line, and then the curve of the bass clef actually curves around that F line, and then you see 2 dots that look kind of like a colon that are surrounding that F line. So the whole symbol is centered around that bass F line, and that is why it is also sometimes called the F clef. Now quickly I'll go over the names of all the lines and the spaces on the bass clef, and you can also certainly come up with an acronym to remember these names as well. But again, in my opinion, it can be much easier to just memorize a few key notes or landmark notes that are very important to know. And then from those landmark notes, you can find by moving in steps or skips from one note to another note to find what the next note is. So on the bass clef, from bottom to top, the lines are G, B, D, F, and A. And all of those notes are below middle C. Whereas the treble clef, all of those notes are above middle C. Now with the spaces, from bottom to top, the 4 note names are A, C, E, and G. Now let's talk about a few landmark notes that can be very helpful to memorize to help you read music much more quickly. So we already talked about bass F and where that is, and that is a really important one. The next one I recommend to memorize is bass C. Now bass C is the second space of bass clef, counting from the bottom. So space 1, space 2, and that's bass C. Bass C, in terms of what exact pitch it is 1 octave lower, or 8 notes lower, than middle C. Now the next landmark note that I recommend memorizing is where middle C is on the bass clef. So if you remember, in the treble clef, the middle C was the first ledger line below or lower than the treble clef. Now in the bass clef, middle C is the first ledger line above bass clef. So if you're looking at a grand staff, middle C falls right in the middle of the treble and the bass clef on that middle ledger line. Now again, on the bass clef, if you're reading music, you can think about the movement in terms of steps and skips to help you find where you are going, whether that's higher or lower, and then how far that is to find from one note to the next what note you should be playing. Let's say you have one note that's on the 4th line of the bass clef, so that would be bass F, and then let's say the next note is on the first space of bass clef. So this is a little bit more than just one step or skip. So what I recommend when you're first learning to read music is first you find what direction it's moving in. So is it moving higher or lower? So in this case, the note is moving lower. Then next, think about how many steps and how many skips put together are you moving higher or lower? In this case, if we count, we're moving from the 4th line down to the first space of the bass clef. So we are moving down 2 lines plus 1 space, which is 2 skips plus 1 step. So then in the musical alphabet, you'd want to think about you're moving from F, you skip over E, you go to D, you skip over C and go to B, and then you'll add 1 more step to that, which is A. So now you know you're moving from F down lower to A. And that is a quick way to read from one note to the next that sometimes can be a little bit easier than simply memorizing the lines and the spaces and the names that go along with them. Now eventually, as you continue to practice this over and over in reading music, pretty soon you will memorize what all of the spaces and what all of the lines are. But it can be much faster at first to read music when you're thinking about it in terms of the steps and skips and how far you're moving from one note to the next to quickly find where you need to go. And finally, we're going to finish this video by talking about rhythm in music. So rhythm is an extremely important aspect to music, and rhythm can take a lot of time and a lot of practice to really understand and grasp and feel it inside of you. But today we're going to go over the most basic note values and how many beats each one of them is worth, and then how to count them. And once you have these 3 big things that we have talked about today, the note identification, so knowing how to read it on the clef. Secondly, the interval recognition, or understanding the steps and skips, the distance between 2 notes, understanding that. And then thirdly, understanding rhythms, how many beats need to be counted for each note. Once you understand those 3 things and you can put them together, you're able to smoothly read through music. So we're going to start by talking about the whole note. One of the ways that my students remember the whole note is that it actually kind of looks like a hole. It's just a big circle, or like a donut hole. So the whole note is just a circle, and as you can see, when it's written in music, it usually has these two little dark edges on it, but it also can just be simply written as that kind of sideways oval shape. And the whole note is worth 4 beats. So if you were clapping and counting a whole note, you can either say 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you would hold the note, you'd hold the pitch for that full 4 beats. Or you could say, another way of saying that is ta, ah, ta, ah. And it's totally up to you, whichever way you'd like to count, with numbers or with those syllables. Either way works. And each person is kind of unique with how they like to count rhythm and what makes sense to them. Now, if you take the whole note, which is 4 beats, and you chop that in half, you're left with 2 beats and 2 beats, right? 2 plus 2, which equals 4. This type of note looks like a circle with a line from it. The 2 parts of the note here are called the note head, which is the circle, and then the stem, which is the line that comes out of it. Now the stem can be pointing upwards or downwards, and that does not change the note value. This type of note is called the half note, and it gets 2 beats. So if you were clapping and counting the half note, you would say 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Or if you're counting in just syllables, you could say ta, ah, ta, ah, ta, ah. Now if you take the half note and you chop a half note in half, you're going to be left with 1 beat and 1 beat. So 1 plus 1 equals 2, right? So this 1 beat note has a dark filled in note head with a stem, and this is called the quarter note. There are 4 quarter notes would fit into 1 whole note because each quarter note equals 1 beat. If you were counting the quarter note and clapping it, it would sound like this. 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Or if you're doing syllables, you would say ta, 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 ta. Now, if you took the quarter note and you cut that into half, you would be left with a half beat and a half beat, because half plus half equals 1 whole beat. So a note that equals half a beat is called an 8th note. The reason for this is because 8 of them would fit into 1 whole note, which equals 4 beats. So 8 half beats would make 4 full beats. Now the way that the 8th note is written, it has something a little different from the other notes. So you have the filled in dark note head, just like the quarter note, with a stem, and then the new different thing about it is that it has what is called a flag, that you can see kind of that curvy line that comes off of the stem. That is called a flag. Now that is if the 8th note is by itself. But if the 8th note comes in groups of 8th notes, where either 2 or more 8th notes are grouped together, they're going to be connected by what's called a bar. And you can see that right here. It's just that dark bar that connects all of those notes together. Now, the way that it's written does not change the 8th note. No matter how the 8th note looks, it could just be alone and have the flag, or it could be in a group and have the bar, but you'll count it the same way. Here's how you can count your 8th notes. You can say 1 and 1 and 1 and 1 and, or if you're using syllables, you can say T, 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 T. Now, if you take an 8th note and you chop that in half, remember that the 8th note is half a beat. So if you chop that in half, you're left with 2 quarter beats, and these are called 16th notes. Now, there would be 16 16th notes could fit into 1 whole note, because 16 of them make 4 full beats, and 4 16th notes would fit into 1 beat, and then 2 16th notes would fit into half a beat. So again, the 16th note is a quarter of a beat. The way that these are written are very similar to the 8th notes, but you add an extra flag or an extra bar. So they would have 2 flags or 2 bars. So you have that dark filled in note head, the stem, and then if it's by itself, it'll have the flags, so 2 flags, And if they're in a group, you'll have the 2 bars, as you can see here, connecting them. Now, if they have flags or bars, does not matter. They're still counted the same way. And 2 ways of counting. If you're doing the number way, most people will say 1 E and 1 E and 1 E and 1 E and. So just like we talked about, 4 of them fit into 1 beat. So that's why we have the 1 at the beginning and then those little syllables E and. Now, if you are counting with just syllables, you would say, remember for the 8th notes, we said T, T. So now between the T's, we're going to add re. So you're going to go teary, 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 teary. So far, we've talked about the whole note, 4 beats. The half note, 2 beats. The quarter note, 1 beat. The 8th note, 1/2 beat. And the 16th note, 1/4 beat. Now, finally, we're going to wrap up by talking about the dotted half note, which kind of falls between the whole note and the half note. The dotted half note gets 3 beats, and it looks exactly like the half note with the open circle and the stem, and then it has a little dot after it. So its name makes perfect sense. It's a dotted half note. Now, if you were counting the dotted half note, you would count either 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, or you could say ta, 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 So those are the very basics of rhythm when it comes to reading music. Now from here, you could take all of the information that you have learned today in this crash course, and you could read through your favorite song, or you could read through your favorite piece of music written by your favorite composer. This sometimes can take a good bit of time, but now you have all the information that you need to do that and to be able to read it. When you're about to learn a specific song or a specific piece of music, I recommend kind of going at it this way. First of all, realize that it's kind of like a big sandwich where you have a lot of different layers on it, and it can be hard to bite into that thing all at once. So there's a lot of layers to when you're reading music, and it can be very helpful to pick this apart little by little, piece by piece. So I often recommend for my students that first of all, they take the rhythm first and work on the rhythm. So that would mean if it's a single line of music, just clapping it out. So you'd go, 1, 1, 1, E, and whatever that rhythm is, you go through the whole thing, clapping and counting out loud until you can get through very smoothly the rhythm. Now, if you have a grand staff like the piano, I usually recommend tapping the rhythm on your lap or on a surface in front of you. And with your right hand, you'll be tapping the right hand rhythm, and with your left hand, you'll be tapping and counting the left hand rhythm. Now again, this even could be broken down into where you work on just the right hand rhythm first, and then just the left hand rhythm, and then put those together. That can be a helpful way of breaking that down even a little bit further. Once you've worked on the rhythm of the song, then comes the time to actually find the notes. Am I moving higher or am I moving lower from this one note to the next note? And you can slowly work through doing that. And once you've found all of the notes, then you can go back and make sure that you're really closely following the correct notes and the correct rhythm put together. Now, if you're working on a piano piece that has 2 separate hands, it's a good idea to work hands separately and find the notes in the right hand and then the left hand, and then put that together. So that is a comprehensive crash course on how to read music. And I went over a lot of things today, a lot of different pieces, but all of those things, if you have those in your toolbox, you will be able to become a much more proficient sight reader and quickly be able to work through songs and pieces of music. Now, if you are working on reading music right now, go ahead and let me know in the comments below. What is the main thing that you have been practicing and working on recently? I'd love to hear from you. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up down below, and you could subscribe to the All About Music channel for weekly videos on learning music, making music, learning the piano and the violin. Thank you guys so much for watching today, and I'll see you in the next video.